So just as we begin, let me give you an introduction to what our time is going to be about over the next 6 weeks. Corrymeela has always been a place of conversation where we think important matters to do with politics and religion and identity and community are best discussed not in a didactic way where somebody says, here's the truth and submit to it, but rather, here's part of my story, here's part of my learning, here's part of my insight, and then we create a conversation around that. And so for the next 6 weeks, the 6 Sundays in Lent, myself and Sarah Williamson will be your hosts in an hour-long event looking at theology and conversation. And our event this week is in conversation about theology and gender. Before I introduce Rachel Mann to you, I'd like to introduce Sarah Williamson to you. So Sarah, let's bring you up here too. It might be easy when you're looking at, you click on view just so that you can see the speaker. And that way you'll get to see Sarah, whoever is speaking, they'll come up on your screen automatically. That might make it more straightforward for everybody who's involved. So Sarah, you spent 6 years, I think, studying theology, and then you went to work in NHS management. And you continue to work in theology, speaking and leading events and broadcasting. But I've always been very curious about the ways within which theology is part of your work as an NHS health manager. Where does theology come into your everyday work in that role for you?
Well, I suppose I try not to bore people too much about it in meetings. Certainly not at the moment because of everything that we have going on in our health service at the moment. But I mean, I think there's loads of things. The first is it helps me pay attention to who's talking and who's not talking, like what voices are we listening to. It encourages me to think about relationships in work and how we interact as staff and as staff teams, and particularly what we do with patient experiences and how we use those to inform how we build our health system. And I suppose for me, although I'm really passionate about our NHS and the structure and the systems, it's about holding that tension. So on the one hand, as theologians, we're always poking holes in things. We're always looking for the edges. We're comfortable sitting in the margins. And on the other hand, in terms of our health service, I want to be part of building a system which provides what everyone needs, and that it's free at the point of entry. So there's something for me about what I love about theology is that it helps us work with tensions and sit with situations which are uncomfortable and which are sometimes binary. So anyway, I could talk about that a lot. Plus, I get to power dress. I am actually really I'm hearkening after. I just bought a new kimono, and I'm desperate to have a big meeting to wear it to, instead of Zoom. So.
Well, I would invite all of us to consider in one of these theology and conversations to come along wearing clothes that we miss wearing. That could be a very interesting fashion experience of theology. Well, Sarah, you'll be hosting 3 of these events over the next 6 weeks, and I'm hosting 3. And so everybody will get to know you and to get to know your extraordinary insight into theology, as well as your insight into the art of questioning and broadcasting over the next number of weeks. So it's great that we're going to be doing this. So thanks very much, Sarah. I would like to introduce Rachel Mann. Rachel Mann is an extraordinary guest that we have today. We are so honored and lucky to have your time, Rachel. Thank you so much. For those who don't know, I know many people do, Rachel Mann is a priest and poet based in the Diocese of Manchester, and she's studied philosophy and theology and creative writing. She holds a PhD, the title of which was 19th Century Women's Poetry and the Bible. And she's published memoir, fiction, theology, literary criticism and poetry. And she's a priest in the parish of St. Nick's in Burnage in Manchester, and is regularly heard in BBC Radio 4. And she is also, just to add to all of this, both a musician and a music writer, and is a big fan of music, particularly both folk and metal. So Rachel Mann, with all of those magnificent accolades, you're very, very welcome to Theology in Conversation with Corrymeela for Lent 2021.
It's absolutely terrific to be with you, Pádraig. I just feeling really sad that I didn't turn up in a kimono now. I love silk. Silk is just magnificent. And as a sewer, it's just a magnificent material to work with. So.
Oh, there you are. I have actually found a YouTube video of you playing a very heavy metal guitar, Rachel. Did you know that that is existence out there on the internet somewhere?
I mean, that's the thing about the internet. You can find anything, can't you? And you don't have to look terribly hard. And I have no shame or embarrassment about my metal guitar skills.
Oh, you shouldn't. No. They are skills. They're extraordinary skills. Years ago, when we got to know each other at Greenbelt, one evening in a tent in Greenbelt, I said to you, Rachel, could we have a conversation about pronouns? And 20 minutes later, you said, and my second to last point is, and I was transfixed in conversation with you because of your interest in language, and you did a deep dive into the question of power and language and sound and linguistics and the shape of sounds in the mouth. And I suppose as we launch into a conversation about theology and gender in Genesis 1 and 2, what is it about language that has been such an interest point for you in your whole life?
Gosh, I mean, that's one heck of a question. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And we are all caught up in the Word as words, as expressions, as verbs, as nouns, and as adjectives. There was a time in my life, Pádraig, when, particularly when I was obsessed with linguistic philosophy, when I couldn't see beyond language. And in one sense, I still can't. You know, if the beginning is, in the beginning was the Word and is the Word. And isn't that interesting? In the beginning was the Word. There's a sort of past tense there. But we know also that the Word is living and creating. And at the heart of God is this poesis, poesis, the Greek for creating. And so I think in what I'm floundering towards here, and I could yak on for 20 minutes about this, and I know we have more time, is that we are God's poesis. We are part of God's poesis, but we are also called to be co-poets. We are co-creators. And that's the thing about us as these creatures made in the image of God, is if at the heart of the image of God is this creating, then gosh, we are most alive when we are creators. And we don't have to be specific poets or novelists or whatever, but we need to come to terms with the fact that to live is to be a maker, a maker. A creator.
Well, you're answering the question by bringing us into your insight, which is so lovely. You know, you're bringing in Greek and you're bringing in Scots in terms of the maker there. You're bringing in all kinds of ways. So thank you very much, Rachel. We're going to have a deep dive into some conversations about Genesis 1 and 2. We're going to talk, maybe you and I, for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to take some Q&A. And then after that Q&A, we're going to come back, and you and I, Rachel, are going to talk about some of your poems, just so that folks can know the outline of that. And we'll finish at 6:30, whatever that is, where people are. So Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth, when the earth was welter and waste. Just first of all, I mean, I think it's really clear that Genesis chapter 1 is written in a profound style of form and poetry. What is it in Genesis chapter 1 that really appeals to you in the content of that poem?
Well, I made just a couple of little notes for myself. And I've one phrase, the power of contrast. And then on my hand, I always write things on my hand when they're really important to me. Texture and definition. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that when we're encountering this extraordinary creation hymn, which is also a praise hymn, that we're not in the realm of explanation. We're not in the realm of the scientific. Certainly not what we mean by scientific. This is about the way in which language works by contrast, by words sitting alongside each other and helping us to understand and actually defining themselves in relation to one another. And what we see here, I mean, that opening, I'm looking at the Fox translation here. When the earth was confusion and chaos, and rushing spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, God said, and there's a speaking there. And again, that speaking, which is making, which is poetry, but about then setting apart, God set apart light from darkness. And these kinds of definitional gestures, the way in which actually what we find here is this unfolding of texture, which is for me is part of the character of my work, what I'm trying to do as a poet. I mean, I'm no biblical scholar, you know, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but there is a precision in poetry, and part of the precision making of God in God speaking, in his, her, their speaking, is a definitional thing. And what we we find that it's through that desire to make to define that there's a making sense. You know, the people who created this, the people who were inspired by God to write this, were sense makers like us, searchers after sense and meaning, and finding that meaning is found in the definitional power of language.
There is a linguist called George Lakoff who has written a famous book about linguistics, where he talks about categories, and he talks about one of the primal experiences that might have even been pre-linguistic was the creation of categories. Dangerous things, tasty things, dangerous and tasty things, and then seasonal things, one-off things, freak accidents, and the capacity for all of those things. He's written a book called Women, Fire and Dangerous Things, because in one of the indigenous languages in Australia, women, fire and dangerous things were in one particular category, and different places around the world evolved into linguistically and culturally different categorizations. And what categories do you see in Genesis 1, Rachel?
I mean, gosh, yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, there's light, shade, water, earth, dry, wet, the fecund. I mean, let the earth sprout forth with sprouting growth. This sense of there's a sensuality in that. Can you hear that on the mouth? And there's a beauty in Everett Fox's translation which shows how this language, this praise language, this hymnody of Genesis 1 is something to be said and spoken, that it's an echo of God's speaking. And those categories of sprouting forth, of fecundity, have this dimension of desire and of sexuality and sensuality. What I'm not picking up in this is a kind of language of judgment. You know, that, I mean, I think when people think about Genesis, and we've got to stick with Genesis 1 here at the moment. I don't want us dashing on, beyond this, and we're not talking about Genesis 3 tonight, I guess. But what we've got here is the goodness, that original blessing of creation. What's also I'm seeing here is, and I'm going to shut up in a minute because I'm running out of things that are coherent to say, is a kind of valuing thing as well. I mean, in this translation, there's this talk about, let the earth bring forth living beings after their kind, and herd animals. And I mean, in many translations, I think that's sort of cattle. And there's a lot of talk about cattle, and it, as a separate category, that is one of the final categories before we come to the image bearer. And this is telling us something about the valuing of of particular kinds of creatures in an agrarian community, I guess, as well.
Yeah. I do think the poets who wrote this were, like everybody would have had the necessity to be, people who fended for themselves, people who were agriculturalists. God speaks to God in the plural in this. Let us make Adam, meaning ruddy earth creatures. I mean, that's possibly the best translation of Adam, a ruddy earth creature from the Hebrew. God says, let us make Adam in our likeness, male and female, God created them. Such interesting, textured, careful language about we and the idea of the humankind being made and then being separated into questions to do with the male and female, rather than male or female. How do you read that, Rachel?
Well, can I take this back just one step? That won't surprise you, Pádraig, because I think that one of the things which isn't, I suppose, necessarily clear in the English translation is how, from the very that moment when the Spirit of God appears, we are also in the realm of the feminine as well. I mean, classically, that the Hebrew used for the Spirit there is coded as feminine, and of course, he is used as well as us. And what excites me as a poet, and I appreciate there'll be biblical scholars out there saying, how dare you do this? How dare you? But I'm going to do it. It's the queer richness of that pronoun gesturing, that sense of the way in which God in God's own self escapes the kind of reductive categories. We might use he, we might use she, we might use us or they, but there's in God's own self there's plurality and oneness, but there's also a beyondness of that. And then when the usness of God says, let us make humankind in our own image, I think we are on this point of poetic precarity, where what we want to do, maybe particularly as 21st century binaried individuals, although maybe we're less binary than we were a few decades ago, we want to kind of flatten that out into either or, male or female, but it's male and female. And that sort of note here also, this is textual, so it is about definition, but it's not about separation into an either or. So there's this sort of swirling linguistic possibility here for me. I don't know what you think. I mean, how do you respond to this?
Well, I like how you say it in terms of a swirling linguistic possibility. I suppose I think that the poets involved in writing this were not writing this for it to be studied in theological seminaries in the 21st century. They were writing this to make sense of something, to be meaning makers, as you were saying earlier on. And I think that's partly why we were really curious to talk to you and to have a conversation about gender and theology through the lens of Genesis 1 and 2, because so often in public conversations, people will say, well, the classic God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and, Rebecca, or Adam and Steve, or you can say Neve and Eve in Irish, which is a nice way to move away from the idea of just it being two men as the threat. And so for so many public conversations, the question about Genesis and the formation of humankind in that way is used to say, here's the perfect template about how things should have been had things not gone awry. And I suppose what I'm keen to do and what I find so interesting in this and in talking to you, but also in the text with God being he, she, and we, to realize quite how brilliant and profound and flexible and elastic that text already is. And that's not a 21st century reading of it. That's the original meaning of it.
Absolutely. And that playfulness is embedded in the language, and it will not come as a surprise that for LGBT people and for many trans people, and for those of you who don't know, I mean, I'm very upfront about this. As a trans person, as a trans woman, there has been huge resources found in that moment in Genesis 1:26-27, where God says, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. Let us in our usness delight in their usness, you know. And there's this just the delightful possibilities, and of course people wrangle over that notion of that notion of male and femaleness in 27. So God created humankind in his image, in the image of God did he create it, male and female he created them. And is it male and female, male or female? But gosh, the words there in English, his, it, them. What happens if we dare to treat that text seriously rather than imposing a sort of post 18th century understanding of what you know, sex and gender are supposed to be?
I'm so struck by how you say that this reading of the kind of original poetry provides so many resources, and I think the need for resources does completely tie in with the ways within which these texts have been used to burden people and to oppress people and to justify violence in a way that tells people, here's what you cannot do. I'd like to go on to talk about Genesis 2 in that way, because Genesis 2 seems to have a completely different setup. Once we finish talking about Genesis 2 in about 10 minutes or so, we're going to open up for Q&A. And maybe as you have Q&A, you can put them into the chat. Sarah Williamson and Emily Rawling are both monitoring that, and they're going to be providing some of the questions that have been coming in through the chat for when Rachel and I get on to talk about a chat in a while, talk about or respond to Q&A. Genesis 2, is set in this place. The man is made out of the earth and then taken and put into this garden of jouissance in the place between two rivers, Mesopotamia, made for the man. And there's all of the plants that are there, and again you can hear the farmer poet describing what was there. And then strangely, the man is invited to choose a mate from among the animals. And the man can't find an attractive enough or an appealing enough mate from among the animals. And then the man is put to sleep, and from his rib, something is taken that's closed up. And then it's hard to translate. A helpmeet is often how it's translated in terms of the creation of Eve. But the word is alongside and against. That's so the word itself is very rich. I'm curious where you go to when you read that.
I think the womanist biblical scholar Will Gaffney is really interesting on this. The concept of the mighty helpmeet. That Ezer, which is commonly translated as this helpmate, has got these layers of tyranny. And gosh, for African American people or those who have been dominated by imperial powers, that idea of the secondary, the subaltern, adds just extra layers onto this idea of the helpmeet. But she says that actually this is a word of power, partly because of a misreading of the concept of the rib. This sort of this idea that Eve Shava is removed, is formed from this rib removed from Hadan. It's actually the side, as you say, it's alongside Tsela. And there is I believe some rabbinic scholarship which argues that what we have is a sort of separating in two here of the earth creature, and that this helpmeet is a creature of enormous power and dignity. Yes, we can't get around concepts of difference at this point, but there's wit embedded in this. This is where, gosh, we're so pious in our readings of Scripture. This punning of Ish and Ishtar, the man and the woman, and there's lots of wit in this language. So the mighty worker who works alongside the earth creature is an extraordinary concept. That takes things in slightly different direction. And equally, this won't come as a surprise to you, and I suspect not a surprise to many of our listeners that and viewers that there are feminist and queer scholars who actually argue that though Adam is coded as male, the fact that we start talking about Ish and Ishtar post the work of the side, as it were, the removal of the side, is an indication that maybe we should just talk about the earth creature who holds all of the possibilities of humanity. We shouldn't reduce this dust person to a dust man, as it were.
Yeah. What I can hear is that these texts are so rich in terms of the possibility of understanding right from the beginning. And it's returning to some of the richness of the language from the beginning. But yet the interpretation of that language has been so callous and violent and subjugating for so many millennia in terms of the ways within which women have been created, or women have been spoken about based on the imagination about how women were created. We won't be spending too much time thinking about Genesis 3, but I know you have some particular thoughts about Eve as the one who dared to go against the question of the inherited rules.
I mean, this is, we're in the realm of a poet playing with Scripture. So I'm sure that the doctrine police are going to come for me at this point, Pádraig, but I know I'm in the company of friends.
You are.
So I think that where my speculation around Eve takes its energy is from her subversion of Adam's presumed ability to name things, because that's one of the key things that we discover about this earth man, this dust man, is that he gets to name stuff, and his naming sticks in such a way that it has a fixity and that it cannot be thrown off. Now, as a poet, I want to say that's the work of the literal. It's the classic, you point at something and it is so, and I name you, I dub you this. And gosh, you can imagine the sort of violence that's been done to lots of trans people through, people insisting that one cannot choose a name for yourself. Or to those who have been enslaved, you cannot choose or have anglicized names, etc., etc., etc. And Eve comes along, and in eating the apricot, the apple, the fruit, or taking the risk of inviting Adam into that feasting on the food of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, the knowledge of difference, she invents metaphor. Metaphor is a talking of something that is related but is in a different realm. It takes us into a different realm. And it's not that it's falsehood, although it's read as falsehood by so many. That's why people hate poets, because you poets, you just tell lies all the time. You use language to trick us. Plato hated poets, but Eve takes us into the realm of metaphor. She invents poetry, and she leads the literalist Adam, who thought he knew what the world was like and what all words meant and what reality had to be, into the realm of possibility and a richer and broader truth.
What you're pointing towards is that in the mythology of the Eden story in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, that what Eve did was actually an evolution of their experience, rather than, you know, something to be punished for, as the, you know, the earth man and the earth woman. I heard a Jewish speaker, Aviva Zornberg, speak a number of years ago, and she was speaking to a Christian, and she said, do you call what happened in Genesis 3 the fall? And they said, yeah, that's what we call it. And she said, yeah, we don't call it that in Judaism. She said, we think of it as something more like an expansion. They were always meant to leave. And sitting within the whole story, I found that to be, the mythology of the story, I found that to be so interesting, because I had never heard anybody ask that. And I suppose where I'm interested in the conversation with you, Rachel, is to say, thinking of Eve as inventing metaphor, thinking of Adam as naming, here's what I can see and here's the full name for it, and her going, what do you call this? And that experience of that. What does that mean for us today as you think about theology and you think of the experience of women, you think about gender power, and the disempowerment of women? What do you...
Well, a positive and a negative, and I'm going to try and keep it brief because I'm conscious time is that, you know, moving on, and I know it's simple to say positive, negative. A positive is where we take this power of metaphor seriously, this gift, shall we say, of the myth of Eve. Then we have the possibility to imagine beyond the boundaries of our crushing ideological systems, beyond the boundaries of a doctrine that does not liberate so often, but limits. We have the gift of daring to grow, to actually become those adult children of God in a world of mess and often grubbiness, but also of delightful and delicious possibility. I think the negative is that, you know, was it Nietzsche who said, you know, you can't get rid of God until you get rid of the grammar of God. And I don't know how we get rid of the grammar of patriarchy quite, because those literal readings of those texts kind of haunt us. There's a hauntology. There are spectres in all our imaginations. But maybe it is in acknowledging them that we begin to address them, because the thing is that language is never just mere air. It has real violent effects on bodies. And the violence against women, against LGBT people, against global majority people, people of color, disabled people, is inscribed in the grammar of our faith. And it's horrifying.
Yeah. I know I've had the experience where people have implied that because the possibility of LGBT people is not kind of imagined within the texts of Genesis 1 and 2, that therefore anybody who is LGBT is somehow broken. Or maybe even in a way that some folks might think of it as a positive way, you're wounded. You know, maybe you're not to blame for it, but you're definitely wounded. And that language can be phenomenally violent in terms of the experience for anybody for whom Genesis is being used as the prototype to say you don't fit the prototype.
And the gift I find in the text, particularly in Genesis 1, is that gift of promise, the liberation from the limit, the liberation from the woundedness. And actually, you know, this is not for now, but I find that in what Christ offers us, actually, you know, that Christ is not a place where queer people can take their brokenness in hope of healing, but they find the location of solidarity and celebration and delight, and that they too are image bearers and likeness makers and all of that.
we'll move to some questions, Rachel. There's some interest in questions to do with gender, and two in particular that I've seen so far. One of which is, why do you place the male-female split in the 18th century in particular? That would be really interesting to hear that. And then the other one is to comment a little bit about where you just landed there in terms of speaking about the Christ experience, and how, in light of plural ways of speaking about God, you hold the kind of the supremacy really in the literature of Our Father as the prayer that is given. So those two questions, they're two separate questions, but they're kind of related in terms of language.
Yeah, I mean, just the 18th century thing, I don't pretend to be an expert on this. Adrian Thatcher is a scholar of theology and gender, wrote a really interesting book called Redeeming Gender, and I do recommend it to anyone. And what he draws out in that, which I think is really powerful, is the way in which our discourse, our language around what we sometimes call sexual dimorphism, or the sort of gender binary, the very specific ways in which we talk about male and female, emerged in white hetero European society certainly from the 17th century onwards into the 18th century. Now, you might surprise you saying, hold on a second, the Bible says male and female, or there have been women for forever. Well, we need to remember how things operate in a cultural imagination. And Aquinas, great medieval scholar, influenced by Aristotle, was inclined to see women as a kind of failed man. And that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about 18th century scientific definitions of the body. Until the 17th century, women's bodies, cis women's bodies, female-coded bodies weren't opened up. This is getting quite grim here, and I must shut up. But were being operated on to say, look, these are now different. We can see that a woman's body is different to a male body, but we're inclined still to code them as sort of secondary. The female pelvis coded as a sign of weakness, as a sign of somehow of damage. There's all sorts of stuff in the medical literature, but yeah, I think that in some of the debates we have currently about sex and sexual dimorphism, there's a lack of understanding of the historiography of that. This is a discourse that's generated over time, and of course there have been men and women for forever, but how we're understood is a constantly shifting matter, and is understood through a whole bunch of intellectual reference points. The second question, Our Father, gosh. Look, I'm not for a second suggesting that that language which refers to God in the masculine is somehow, that just needs to go. What I want to do is to say, how do we place close attention to it? Our Father. Now, in what sense are we talking about fatherhood here? People of Jesus's time were no less subtle about the roots to parenthood than we are in our time. In what sense is there as an our fatherhood? But this is also a fatherhood that seems to, at least in many people's imaginations, want to claim the power that's often traditionally reserved for female bodies to themselves. That in the very outset claims the power to just create life. But if also, if we're putting this in the context of those Hebrew scriptures, this is fatherhood that is also defined in terms of a God who, in their very speaking, creates life. So I just want to queer that notion a little bit, actually.
Yeah. So you're saying it isn't quite that you have a problem. It isn't at all that you have a problem with the word father. It's what the word father is meaning in the context of the scriptures is a multi-layered thing.
Yeah.
One of the words for God I think in the book of Isaiah is many-breasted one, which is extraordinary when you look at these old texts. There's a few other questions that are coming in here. Here's one here. There's some questions about not interpreting Judaism about having the fall, rather considering it as the expansion. If we were always meant to leave the garden, as you take that mythology, what does that do to the schema of the way that much of Christianity is set up in terms of the idea about converting back to that original way? What does that do for you?
I mean, yeah, absolutely, yeah, and that's something that I chew over, and and I'm such a divided self. I mean, I'm a dog collar wearer. I am, and I'm someone who's committed to the deposit of faith as it has been revealed in the Church of England. So I have to negotiate those texts, which, I mean, we find in Paul, this idea of Jesus as the second Adam, because of the first Adam, therefore we need the second Adam, and this language of fallenness, is part of the grammar of what it means in so many levels to be a Christian. But I am challenged by that notion that rather than being defined by original sin, we are the creatures of original blessing. And that if we were always, and I'm riffing a bit now, if we're always people, the creature that was going to be called out of the garden, that means that we are called into fresh blessing. But we are called into fresh blessing as creatures with a trace of complexity to us. I mean, and here's the thing, folks. Let us not act as if this garden in Eden is some perfect thing. It had complexity already inscribed into it, didn't it? The very fact that there's this tree at its center that is gonna mess with the humans and who they are if they eat of it, and is forbidden, that's telling us something about the strangeness of that Edenic space.
Yeah.
So,
and then the speaking serpent as well.
Exactly.
Of course. Yeah.
So there's a sort of mess. There's a sort of mess in there. So for me, the blessing is to be found in the living through the mess and being attentive to the gifts of God as they're presented. And this is why, I think it's really important for me as a Christian, not to start treating the law of God, the law of Moses, as some, in that sort of rather supersessionary way of saying, oh, that's all been done and gone. That's about gift too. This is how, that the sort of Hebrew perspective on the law is its gift. And it's all about what are the levels of gift that we are called into, and being called into Christ for me is another, dimension, horizon of gift.
I think the last question I look at, there's a couple that have come in that where people are saying, so is there the idea that Adam was naming, and that was a fairly surface level thing, and under that was the metaphor? And is that like saying, oh, look, there's truth, and then there's mythopoetic analysis? And I suppose we've seen in the last number of years questions to do with it's not new, but the messing around with truth and fake news and all of that, the chaos that can be used for civic manipulation. How do you speak to the question of that? Bringing subtlety to the Adam naming, and then subtlety to the Eve and introducing metaphor.
I mean, I don't want to be binary about it to say, I mean, I've rather sort of rhetorically presented it as literal versus metaphorical. Literal, you know, that is the word sticks to the thing, and the thing is then the word. For me, the theopoetic possibility of Eve is the revealing of that which was always there. It's that, and it's a sort of removal of a kind of complacency and arrogance about the power of naming, about the way in which names might be seen to work. And actually, that's what I've never seen this in language. You know, that things just won't stay in place. You know, words won't stay in place. They're forever they're slippery.
Yeah.
But I think, of course, I don't want us to get lost in a realm of fake news or, you know, anti-truth, where everything goes. But we have to be attentive to the slipperiness of language. And what that means is, and here's the kicker for me, this is never about individuals. This is never about language being free-floating. This is about a community shaped by love and truth-seeking and grace, and acknowledging it's going to screw it up and cock it up, and it will be messy. But that's the invitation, is into the community that seeks to be a truth-bearing community in its being and in its use of language, but acknowledging that it's never just going to be simple, because as soon as the community decides that it's simple, that's when the tyranny starts. You know, that's when the power over becomes the operating principle.
Rachel, over and over again, I've heard you speak at Greenbelt or on broadcasts or in sermons, and I've read some of your books, and I'm always struck by the kind of extraordinary level of your intelligence, and that you regularly bring your analysis back to this word love. And that's the name of your your first full volume of poetry, A Kingdom of Love. And I'm so interested that in the temptation to cleverness, that you use cleverness to bring us back to an original point to do with love. And I wonder if you'd be able to read a few poems. There was one question that had come in out of curiosity to say, in the presence of so many options about names to give God, what name do you give God? And I know that your poem Credo goes around that. And I wonder if you'd be able to share that poem with us, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, do you want me to start with Credo, and do you want me to read? I've got three that I could read. Shall I read the three and then?
Read the three. Read the three, and then
I'll finish with Credo, and we'll come back to that, because gosh,
lovely.
Yes, yeah. So, this is from a section which is an exploration of, I suppose, priestly identity and human identity, and the section is called A Kingdom of Love. The first poem is called this. Ubi Caritas. We learn the world, the first world of love, and drool and sweet milk through lips. What surprise that prayer shares a language with kisses. The book of Genesis. Before holy or righteous, before the law, before sound was distilled, so many crossings out into Bet, Aleph, Nikud, before all that, song. Oh, to taste fricatives, damp from lip and palate, dental trills, the spirit chewed by teeth, ejected from lungs, an offering. Oh, to know, before the book, decision. Should the fruit be plucked or crushed? And love, What place love? Credo. I am racked by assertions. God is not a name. God is love. God is. God is. A person without a name is not. That is one of history's truths. I have seen the films of the camps where names are erased. If God, if God is to be claimed as lover, I must multiply names. Pneuma, the three in one, mother, tetragrammaton, al-Wajid, Bhagwan, Diabolos, Jesus. Jesus puts a tongue into my mouth. I am.
Rachel, thank you so much for these delicious poems. I'd like to talk to you about them. We'll start with the last one you read there, you know, that kind of reflection, bringing Holocaust into the ways within which people seek to erase names. I've seen the films of the camps where names are erased. And this idea, therefore, as the many names for God. Could you talk to us about the impetus behind that poem, as well as then those delicious names that you give to the God?
I struggle, Pádraig, with names, not least because I'm someone who's had to find a name and to name myself, as it were, to discover that name. But God is so much more than a designation. You know, the naming, it's the Adam thing, name, get fixed. And yet, without a name, when we're not addressed by our name, that erasure, that Shoah, which was so demonstrated by the violence undertaken in the camps, reveals that we are the kind of species that can deprive people of names and therefore their reality. So the impetus behind this poem is to live in the tension, between saying that the divine, which we bear within us and which is us, and of which the community of which we are part, goes beyond name, and yet the name helps us find our way deeper into that communion, into ourselves and into others and into God. And therefore, you know, something that I remember, one of my spiritual directors, my first spiritual director, who's alas has now gone to glory, said to me once, Rachel, dare to try out names, dare to multiply names, because in the multiplication you may find the maths that lead you to that conclusion, temporary though it will be, about who God is for you now, this day and this moment. But know that sometimes you just have to go the negative route and strip it all away. Yeah. Because God will always elude.
That poem is so rich in terms of theology. And I remember when I read it the first time, I laughed out loud because it finishes with a little nod to Graham Kendrick. Jesus puts a tongue into my mouth, which I had never expected to find little references to things that I experienced at Summer Madness or Spring Harvest coming up inside there in your poem. And even the other one about prayer, sharing a language with kisses, about suckling, about kiss, about the physicality of having a mouth. You're taking these things from the concept down into the physicality to say your tongue, your lips, your mouth. Talk to us about your interest in that, to go into the body and to the physical experience of tongueness, mouthness, when it comes to the things that you're doing here in terms of sacramentality and priesthood.
Well, I guess that would have been one other frame of reference we could have explored tonight, Pádraig, is around the line of the body. I mean, I've long since believed that bodies are the theatres of our lives, and that bodies are our primary way of knowing the living God. And gosh, this comes back to the potency of the Mass, of the Eucharist, that the gift of God's revealing of God's self is in through the things of the body. And the beauty of the body is not in its sort of ironclad resilience that, you know, will last 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or whatever, but is in its dust, is in its precarity, it's in its inbuilt failure. And, you know, that's the work of resistance of the sacrament. It's a work of resistance against all that is within us as human beings that wants to deny our God self. Because, you know, we think God self, oh, it's eternal and forever and ever and ever. Well, our understanding of God self is in our dust, is in our bodies falling apart, is in, gosh, and I'm conscious we need to finish here, and I could get emotional at this point, but is in our need for proximity and what it might be called the haptic, to do with touch. And as someone who is so deprived of touch at the moment through this pandemic and all of that, the hunger of the body, which is so often treated as a negative and is so regulated by the church and doctrine, the hunger of the body is a hunger for God's desiring of us and our desiring of God. And it's beautiful, and it's precarious, and it's dangerous, and it has grief and the possibility of violence threaded through it. And yet it is the promise of all that we have, and its fragility is its beauty.
Rachel Mann, poet and priest, writer, broadcaster, thinker and communicator. We are in such gratitude for you coming into this virtual Corrymeela room. Thank you for bringing your hospitality and sharing your hospitality to all of us. Thank you so much.
You're a superstar yourself, Pádraig. Thank you all for having me.
Thanks, Rachel. A couple of very quick announcements as we finish off. We'll be back through the same link next week. And next week we are going to be having Sarah Williamson in conversation with Leah Shimada and Sophia Raymond about migration. Particularly, they'll be thinking about migration in terms of the ways we understand our religious texts, the ways that our understanding and our reading of texts and traditions migrates. But obviously we'll also be talking about the actual reality of human migration in bodies. You can sign up to Spirituality of Conflict emails. Corrymeela is one part of a network of organisation and friends across Britain and Ireland who every Monday email out a reading of the Sunday lectionary gospel text through the lens of conflict. And if any of you would like to sign up for that, we'll put the link in the chat right now. And just to let you know, some people were asking whether these are going to be recorded. One of the things that we're aware of is that there can be a desire to record these to look back later on, but that puts the situation where the individual who's speaking has what they've said on the internet forever and ever. So we're kind of going to take a decision about this at the end of every event, particularly talking amongst ourselves as a team to figure out, are there ways in which we can make this available for people who want to re-listen, but also in a way where the person speaking or the people speaking isn't necessarily going to be in a situation where they have to feel tied to what they've done, because we're not paying them enough to have something that's going to be permanently up, not paying them at all most of the time. So thank you so much to everybody for coming into this virtual space to reflect. We will so look forward to being with you next week. I'll send an email out tomorrow that will come to the email addresses of folks who registered with some links to Rachel's books, as well as some information about next Sunday's event. And we will look forward to seeing you back here. Corrymeela has a new podcast out as well. If you put the Corrymeela podcast into wherever you find podcasts, it's a 12-episode series where we're examining Britishness and Irishness. with individuals that we're talking to, particularly in this year that marks the centenary of the partition of Ireland and is also the first year of the Brexit protocol. These are important issues for us, as at some point within the next 10 to 15 years, there's likely to be a referendum on the question of the border in Ireland. And what we think is important is that we get used to talking about it. Good people will vote in different ways, but finding a way to talk wisely now about it is going to be a really important thing. So we look forward to being back with you in this room next week. Thank you once again to Rachel Mann and to Sarah Williamson and Emily Rawling for the support. Sarah Williamson will be presenting next week, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much, everybody.